Thank you all so much for joining us for the Qualitative versus Quantitative Research, Which Should You Use workshop. Joining us today is Dr. Natalie Pennington, Assistant Professor of Communication Studies. She's going to be discussing differences between qualitative and quantitative research and reviewing which ones are best used when. So I'm going to hand it over to her to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nevena, and thank you all for coming to participate today. I know this one had to be rescheduled, so I appreciate your flexibility with things. As she mentioned, my name is Dr. Natalie Pennington. I am an assistant professor in the Communication Studies Department. I am also our graduate student coordinator. I love research methods. These are all the classes that I teach, both at the graduate and the undergraduate level. And I also make use of both qualitative and quantitative methods. So when they mentioned that they were going to be doing this workshop, I jumped on the opportunity to participate because I think this is something that people get scared of easily and kind of stick to one method, when I think very much the type of questions you're asking should dictate the method you use rather than saying, I'm only going to do this one thing. So my hope today is to sort of make sure that you have a clear sense of all of the different types of methods. And there's way more than the list that I'll provide, but since we've only got an hour, I'll limit it to a few from each side of things. I'm also going to talk about examples from my own research. So as I mentioned, I use both qualitative and quantitative methods in the work that I do. And so I'll show you specific examples of research questions that I've asked and talk about the approaches I picked and why. And then my big hope, of course, and this was mentioned in the call for this, is that at the end, if you have any questions about research you're doing, then those are things we can workshop together so we can hear different ideas and kind of help each other. That's one of, again, my favorite things to do in a methods class is just, you have to just start talking about what you want to study and asking those questions to help you along. So to get us started, we can think about qualitative and quantitative research as sort of operating primarily in two different paradigms. You have the social scientific paradigm, which tends to be the quantitative research methods, and you have the interpretive paradigm, which tends to be the qualitative research methods. And when I say research methods, I'm referring to a wide range of things, but we can break those down and sort of look at a few examples and we'll talk about each. So quantitative research, we can have survey, experiment, or content analysis. Qualitative research, I can have interviews, focus groups, but I could also do a content analysis. And so content analysis is a really good example we can look at and talk about how they're looked at in kind of both capacities. So if I start with the interpretive side, which I mentioned is also called the qualitative side, and you can kind of hear those terms interchangeably. This is where I really am trying to ask much more descriptive questions. It's the hows and the whys. I'm not necessarily trying to find a relationship between two variables. Instead, I'm really interested in kind of having maybe a deeper understanding of what's going on. And so, of course, in relationship, I mentioned the qualitative methods that we'll look at examples of today: interviews, focus groups, and content analysis. You've maybe heard of focus groups before in your area of study. Some are more common than others. But a focus group, it consists of anywhere from 3 to 10 people. I tend to think that kind of 5 to 7 is the sweet spot, who come together to talk about a topic. And a focus group can be really helpful when you want some of that like group think building off each other, thinking about things. It's not always great though. So there's times where, for instance, if you're studying a sensitive topic, you probably don't want to pick a focus group, because if people aren't going to talk about it in front of just you, they're certainly not going to talk about it in front of their peers as well. So definitely kind of being cognizant of the types of questions you're asking in terms of how invasive they are for privacy purposes can be something to think about. If, on the other hand, you're trying to get a sense of kind of collectively how people view something, then focus groups can be really helpful for you in your particular area. Interviews, by comparison, are typically one-to-one. So I interview people to talk to them about their communication choices pretty regularly. One of my most recent examples with interviews is that I talked with undergrads about their first 6 months experience, sort of lived experience narrative of the pandemic, and said, you know, what has it been like for you? And talked through that one-on-one with them. What's nice about interviews is you've got a lot more flexibility on kind of where and how to host it. And I think that there's been lots of technological advances made so that you don't have to just do those in person. So increasingly, we've seen that interviews can be effective through things like email and phone calls and video chat. And so certainly if you want to know more about that approach to things, I can talk about that at the end too. The last type of qualitative research that I'll kind of briefly touch on are content analysis. So a content analysis requires that you have some sort of initial content that exists that you want to make sense of. So qualitatively, I might do a content analysis where I look at tweets on President Biden's page, or I might look at Disney movies and looking at sort of messages that come out of those. And what makes qualitative research distinctly different than quantitative is how I make sense of the data that I create. So in doing the focus groups and in doing the interviews, I would record those and transcribe what's been said. And then in the content analysis, I of course already have that data sitting there for me to analyze. And qualitatively, one of the most common approaches people will take is called a thematic analysis, where I as an individual would go through the data very systematically and identify codes that I see, sort of common things, and then let those regroup together to make themes that have emerged from my data. These aren't always driven by theory. Sometimes you're actually kind of taking what's called a grounded theory approach, where it's more of what we maybe don't know yet, and that's why we need the qualitative work there, versus quantitative, which is a little bit more theory testing. So that's the qualitative side of things. And again, like I said, I'll talk about examples in my own work as we go along to sort of help you out. So the other side of it, the social scientific side, and these are the classes that I tend to teach a little bit more often. I think they're more commonly required across the university. So psychology makes use of a lot of social scientific. Of course, it's a part of communication studies. If you're in business or any of the other social sciences, there's a good chance you had to take like a stats class or something, either as an undergrad or a grad student. And so for this side, this is where we have things like surveys, experiments, and again, content analysis. And here it's really about being systematic. So your goal is that you're typically saying there are two variables or more that I want to make sense of and their relationship and make some sort of bigger comprehensive claim. And so for a survey, which of course I think we're probably all familiar with taking surveys in some capacity, and we can think of those as like BuzzFeed quizzes or surveys. And those are just asking you questions in your opinion to make sense of a particular phenomenon. At the same time, I might want to experimentally manipulate something. And so an experiment, at least in my area of study, might be where when we actually have a communication research lab on campus, I could bring people into the lab and divide them into groups to have particular types of conversations. And then I could watch to see how those conversations unfold based on how they engage, and also maybe even giving them a survey before and a survey after to say, okay, so how supported do you feel from your friend? Talk to your friend. Now, how supported you feel? And we might find that in some particular cases, they feel more or less supported. And it's just like a off the top of my head example here. But that's an experimental design. We could do those online too, so they don't always have to involve a research lab. So for instance, I could have two versions of a survey where one group gets one condition and another group gets another. I've had students who have studied things like how does political satire help us make sense of what's going on in the news. And so one group might get a CNN article while the other group might get a John Oliver clip, and being able to see how after dealing with that stimuli, they respond and engage with it. And so experimental design has lots of intricacies. I've done experiments, and I think that especially as a graduate student, I would recommend, always planning for the worst case scenario, but they're definitely doable still. The last one is content analysis. And so you might be asking, how is a content analysis different quantitatively than qualitatively? Well, a quantitative content analysis, again, it's that systematic. So I'm going in and I'm coding for those numbers. What times of day do people tweet? And making a very systematic claim where it might be the tweets that get the most engagement happen at 5 p.m. And actually, that there is research that says if you post right when people are getting off work, that's when you're going to see greater engagement. And that might not be the case during COVID, but it's just kind of an example of where quantitatively I might be trying to make sense of something. And so if you're into marketing, then that would show, okay, well, I should be posting as my organization around this time of day rather than a time that might not get that peak engagement for people. So let's look at some examples of each of these kind of more in depth. And again, as I'm talking, if you've got questions, I'm happy to help you out in some capacity. So the first is a survey example. And again, these are all studies that I've done. So the survey example, the research question is, do social media users gain social support from the Facebook profile of deceased friends? And so one of my first studies that I ever did was actually to look at how people engaged with social media if they had a profile page of somebody who had passed away. Do you unfriend that person? Do you post on the page? Do you like the page being there or not? How close were you even to the person? Because that could also influence things. And so in this capacity, I thought a survey was appropriate because it allowed me to kind of build on some earlier work that I had done that was qualitative. So this quantitative one, I already came in saying, I think that there is a chance that this is the case, but it could also differ for different people. And so trying to make sense of that through a survey was really helpful for me to reach a broader audience. Because that's one thing I didn't touch on, is that qualitatively, we tend to have a much smaller sample size because my goals aren't necessarily to generalize to a broader population. Instead, my goal might just simply be to have that kind of rich data that makes sense or transfers onto someone else's perception. But with quantitative research, I might want to expand on that. And so my goal could be the survey, if I had done interviews to kind of get a sense of things. Now I think, okay, wait, there's something going on here. I'll do a survey so that I can get a broader audience to sort of continue to make claims about potential social support that would happen. So as I mentioned, this study came from a prior one about interviews that I did. So this was actually one of the first studies I did as a grad student. I said, how do users describe their experience with a Facebook profile page of a deceased friend? And these were really hard to do. You know, I think it's one thing that people don't always think about is you can pick a topic because you like a topic, but interviews can be really emotionally draining for you as the researcher. So knowing going in for your qualitative research, depending on your questions, right? If you're in social work, if you're in psychology, if you're in couple and family therapy, you might find yourself touching on some sensitive topics. And so I recommend that you feel as ready to help the person as well as help yourself. And so I really had to space these interviews out over time because otherwise I was talking to 4 or 5 people a day about someone they knew who had died. And it was definitely a little stressful, I think, for me to kind of have that information and take it in all at once. But it's also really rich, right? Like what I get from talking to those people about their experience, more can emerge from that than I would ever get in the survey. In the survey, I could say, okay, well, I think that it's a question of how close you were. I think it's a question of this. I think it's a question of this. But I only knew those things because I did the interviews. And so really thinking about and saying beforehand when you're getting started, what do we know and what can we know? Then qualitative research and that interpretive approach can really help field and help us to be able to do a good quantitative study. I don't think I could have done the second study without having known what I did from the first project. And so that's where also you can see a little bit of what's called triangulation. And so increasingly researchers are really encouraging people to make use of multiple methods or mixed methods where they can draw the two together. And so I've definitely done that in research as well. And I'll show you some examples as we talk. So the next one is a focus group example for you all. And so again, I often tend to view qualitative research as sort of a first step. If I feel like there's not enough known out there on a topic that I'm interested in, then the quantitative approach may not be best for me because I might just be stumbling into the dark and miss something. If I do a qualitative project first, like interviews or focus groups or content analysis, then I can really make sense of some things to inform that, again, survey or experimental design. In this case, the focus group actually informed an experiment. So the focus group, the research question was, what are reasons that people provide for unfriending or unfollowing someone on social media? And this, like I said, it's like a very innocuous topic. I think even right now, if I was to just, we were stop recording and said, let's all chat, I think you all could build off each other and someone would say, oh, well, I unfriended someone because of politics. And someone else would be like, yeah, me too. And we start to kind of see those themes emerge amongst the participants where they're sort of confirming or denying what things do or do not cause us to unfriend or unfollow. And so for me, that was great because I was able to generate a list. There wasn't a lot of research about this at the time. A little bit we kind of hinted at, and you heard, like, again, anecdotal stories about politics, for example, people who overshare as well. And so that focus group study allowed me to do an experimental design. Now that I had generated my list, which was things like posting about politics, posting about kids, oversharing, never talking, getting in an argument with them. And what I did was I had participants actually get experimentally assigned 10 different friends, where I said, okay, log into Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, every 10th friend, every 20th friend. If this person did these things, would you unfriend them, unfollow them, or do nothing? And so this experimental design had them go into their own network, and allowed me to get a sense of, right off the bat, both with strong ties and weak ties, kind of how we respond to things. And for those that are interested, the answer is we basically do nothing. We're really inclined to keep the status quo and not unfriend or unfollow, even if we get in a fight with someone, which I thought was interesting. But so that's an experimental design example. Another study that I did is called a lens model analysis. This one is not one that I included in that initial list, but is a good example of where we can draw on multiple methods to make sense of something. So this research question said, can one accurately predict personality traits of a social media user based on their profile page? So for example, the only person in the room right now that I have ever had any sort of conversation with is Nevena, but even then we don't know each other that well. So if I was to go to any of your Facebook page or Twitter page or Instagram, there would be certain cues that I might be able to predict things about your personality that would be accurate. So for this study, we had the person, so in this case, all of you, fill out a personality test, right? How extroverted are you? How neurotic are you? How open to experience are you? So we had you do that. Then we would also have the person give us a sample of their Facebook page. So we took the last month of posts plus like static profile picture information. And then we stripped that of like your name so that they were private. Went in and coded for things. So like, how many Facebook friends do you have? How extroverted do you appear in your picture? Is your picture of you or of something else? And then the third step was to have a stranger come in and look at your profile and then make some claims about your identity and be like, okay, well, I see this, so I think this. And so a lens model analysis quantitatively allows us to say, if a stranger thinks these things matter, and I say, this is me, how does my page in the middle of there help me make sense of it? So we know, for example, that having a lot of Facebook friends tends to suggest that you're more extroverted. However, it doesn't always help us make sense of what that, who are those friends in your network. So it can only do so much for us. So in this case, this is a good example where I started with a quantitative study and actually flipped qualitative as the second approach, where one of the things we asked people about was what's called humor orientation. So humor orientation is the ability for someone to create humor. And we often get that very much overlapped and miscommunicated with extroversion. We think if somebody's extroverted, they're also funny. It's not the case. But we did find from our quantitative study a list of cues or actions that people could take on Facebook that displayed humor. But humor is a very subjective thing, right? And so I went back in as a qualitative coder of these 100 profiles and coded the data that existed on the profiles and turned those into themes to make sense of the type of humor that people were using on Facebook. So I could say status updates are a really good indicator of one's ability to convey humor, and the type of humor that they're using tends to be relationally driven. And so that was kind of an interesting way to think about how people engaged with humor online. And I learned more by making use of both qualitative and quantitative methods. But in this case, I started with the quant and moved to the qual. So there is sometimes where we might flip things with our examples. Another study example, I think I mentioned this at the start, this is one of my most recent projects that I'm doing. So I've interviewed people to talk about their experience with social distancing and asked them to describe their experiences for sustaining relationships during the pandemic. And so it was really saying, if we think back about the last 6 months, what has this experience been like for you? And I thought that interview effective here to complement research I had already done that was a survey that kind of said, of course people are lonely, of course people are stressed, of course people miss their friends. We know those things are true. Like scales are going to tell me that, sure. But what happens is that in interviewing people, again, that rich data, you can't replicate that. And that's why I think that it's so important to make use of both types of methods. For me to hear stories from people about, for example, and these are the ones that stick with me, even though I did these interviews last September, a girl talking about how her mom would drive her for her job so that she could spend time with her mom, but then also like she was like a DoorDash or Postmates or something driver. And that allowed her and her mom to feel closer when they probably wouldn't have spent that time together otherwise. A girl whose boyfriend broke up with her because she wouldn't go out, and she was like, no, I need to stay home and be safe for my mom. And so he broke up with her, which just made me so mad for her. So lots of different examples that again still stick with me. And so for me, it was about saying what relationships thrive, what relationships suffer, and really being able to provide a more example rich experience so that when someone reads that article, they're like, wow, yeah, that's similar to my experience. If they can kind of see themselves and what I found, then I feel like I've done a good job as a qualitative researcher. But that, like I said, I did quantitative work on this too, and I'm happy to talk about those examples. But this is really just a way to say, there are so many topics we could study with so many different types of methods. And it's really just about making use of those in a way that fits what you want to ask and what you want to know. So I did have one for the survey. I wasn't sure if so surveys comparison, as I said, is there a relationship between the type of tech used and well-being. So this is where, for instance, people think video chat is awesome. It's actually not that great. Video chat can drain us. It can make us stressed. But I can only say there's an association between those two things with a survey. I can't say one causes the other. I may just already be stressed and drained. But since there's such a high association between the two, we do think that there's a chance that video chat is problematic, while things like phone calls and texting can actually be really helpful for people. But again, this gets at different questions than what the qualitative study got at. So it's really what are you trying to understand and what are you trying to know? And likely your field of study that you're in sort of dictates that to some extent too. I haven't even talked about here, but communication studies actually has a third approach. So we have quantitative methods, qualitative methods, and then rhetorical methods. And that's very case study driven. Rhetorical criticism has a single artifact typically that you study and analyze and make sense of. And so that may be the case in your work as well. But I definitely think triangulation still happens. And for us, qualitative sort of rests in the middle area where rhetorical scholars might engage in some qualitative field methods, while quantitative scholars may also make use of some things. So for example, and of course I want to open this up to questions, but another type of qualitative method that I didn't touch on a lot because it's not my own experience is ethnographies. And so ethnographies are really about embedding yourself within a population. And so, for instance, if you're in like a sociology program, getting to be a part of a group and really make sense of their kind of norms and practices can allow you to be a participant, but also an observer in the practice. My research questions just don't tend to go there, so it doesn't make sense for me to do ethnography. I think that they're fantastic, and it really just depends on what you're trying to study. But I'd love to talk with you all now, and I'll stop my keynote here and just say, what are your own questions for research, and how do you think those drive your methods? And of course, if you have any questions for me, I'll keep the chat open as well while we're going. And if there's like a method you want me to talk more about too, I can do that.
Please feel free to either unmute yourself or just type in the chat if you have any questions.
Hi, Dr. Pennington. Thank you for your time today. I had a quick question in terms of if you could talk a little bit more about transcript, or interview transcribing, and then because I feel like that straddles a weird space between quant and qualitative research, and just if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Great question. So transcription and qualitative research, first of all, I'll say it is just like a practical standpoint. This can take a really long time. So the reason we want to have a transcript of the conversations that we have, whether it be focus groups or interviews, is that I can go back and actually code and make sense of those things. So there is software you can use to do the coding. So in Vivo is one that UNLV has. I'm really a big fan of a program called Deduce, DEDOOSE. It's a monthly fee-based program that actually will just hold everything in stasis for you. So if you're like, dump your stuff in there, but don't have time right now, pay for 1 month, let it go static, reopen it 6 months later, and you're good to go. But the reason we need the scripts is so that we can do the coding. So it's not really something that feeds quantitative research, because quantitative research is like, here's a number that is attached to this thing, while a transcript is like, this is the conversation so that I can build on that. And when I do interviews and focus groups, I take notes too. So like this last one that I was talking about where I interviewed people, I'd have, you know, my WebEx screen up on one side and I'd have a notes tab open so that I could type some things to myself to remember as well that help. And that's just so that as you're doing those interviews, you kind of grow and learn and say, ooh, you know, I'm starting to notice that people are saying this a lot, right? I started to notice that people were really pushing silver linings and that they were like, well, you know, it was really doom and gloom for like the first 3 months, but it gave me a chance to spend time with my family. But it gave me a chance to learn a new hobby. And so kind of catching that language and approach to things is something that I can make notes to myself, but then also go back and pull those transcripts really quickly so that I can form those themes to say, well, you know, people found a lot of silver linings, and that was pretty helpful for them. I hope that answered your question. I was like, quantitatively, it's numbers, right? On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about this? Versus a qualitative study, I'd be like, you know, tell me how you feel. Like, what is that like for you? And you kind of have that richness where you draw in quotes. So my findings give those specific stories, like I mentioned in the paper I wrote. I say, you know, one theme is this, and it's represented through and using pseudonyms for my participants, fake names. I'd be like, well, Sam suggested that for them, it was like this. And so it's fresh in my mind because I've been writing the study. But so that's like examples. Whereas quantitatively, I'd be like, on average, people reported that they were pretty stressed. On a scale of 1 to 5, the average score of over 1,900 people was a 4. And that's pretty stressed on a scale. But again, I said those things are, you know, to be expected. And so we use the numbers in quantitative to make our arguments, and we use the words in qualitative. Oh, and I've got
like
2 questions. Yeah, sorry, I see 2 questions, so I'll take the first one and then move to the second. So the first one said, talk more about mixed methods. Is it just a mixture of qual and quant, or is there a specific procedure? There's not a perfect procedure to follow. And, you know, I'll tell you, while it's a communication studies article, I actually have a piece that I really love that talks about mixed and multiple methods. It's really short. So I'll pass that along to Navina to distribute to anybody who wants it. But it's just a really great piece to talk about how we do those things. So mixed methods and multiple methods mean 2 different things. A mixed approach is where I would take a quantitative and a qualitative and use those together to triangulate my findings. So like with the humor study where I said, quantitatively, I know status updates predict someone's humor orientation, but I don't know what kind of humor they're producing. So qualitatively, I can go in and code that data to make sense of humor and see that it's relationally driven. And so I can use those 2 pieces together. Sometimes I might also make use of multiple quantitative methods. So for example, I might use both a survey and an experiment, or I might have a content analysis and a survey. Qualitatively, that first study I was talking about, so very first study I ever did, first thing I ever published, was that interview study that talked to people about friends that had passed away. And I actually ended up sending into the IRB after the first set of interviews a request to also do content analysis of the profile page of the friend who had passed away. So then I was able to couple together a post from the page with the interviews to use those 2 data sets together to form my argument. And so there's not, like I said, not a perfect procedure. It's really just thinking about your question. And so for me, it's always the, again, how much do I know to begin with? And if there's not a lot out there, qualitative might help me get there so I can build into this. Other times I might feel pretty confident with the things I'm trying to ask, quantitatively assess it, and be like, ooh, but maybe there's more there. One way to do this is also including open-ended questions in your survey. So surveys we tend to think of as closed-based questions, where it's, again, that like on a scale of 1 to 7, strongly disagree, strongly agree, mark your gender, mark your race, mark your age. But it's totally fine to include open-ended questions too. And I always try to put those in my studies to be like, tell me about a time, so one of my areas is political interpersonal conflict on social media. And so I said, tell me about a time that you fought with a friend or family member about politics and what happened. Just tell me a story. And I was able to code those open-ended questions to get more data out of that. And so that allowed me to have both the survey, but also this coded data that was separate. So it's really very dependent on the study you're doing. I wish I had a better answer, but lots of examples. And I think that if you go and look up methods journals or put in even mixed methods for a search, you'll see those things kind of overlap. And this next question is actually a really nice tie-in with that. So I've got, I noticed that in my field, there's a large theoretical divide between qualitative, interpretive, and quantitative positivist-based research. Is this something you see in your own field or others? I'm in anthropology. Oh, absolutely. So for, I think, a very long time, and this is why I really want to send that article to you all to see, because I think a lot of people feel like you're only supposed to be one thing. And, there's a lot of talks like, don't try to be everything. Research methods classes in all the methods. I took more methods classes than I did topic classes in my PhD program. And that's because I would much rather go and read about the theory by myself and feel like I can like self-teach myself the theory, but I can't self-teach myself the methods. So taking a class in just regression, taking a class in just ANOVA, taking a class, I took 3 different qualitative classes, one for designing qualitative, and then the classes for analyzing qualitative data, because there's so many approaches you can consider there. So I would say like always take the methods classes, and that's why I teach the methods classes as well. But those divides exist. And a good example of that is where I was just saying at the end, like I don't use ethnography. I think ethnography is the biggest example of a truly interpretive approach. But that doesn't mean that there's not some interpretive elements within the interview focus group content analysis too. And so how you choose to approach it, I think, can help bridge those gaps. I think I'm very much the middle zone in my department. I have 2 faculty who are very much a post-positive quantitative scholars. And we have one person who very much, she's just like embeds herself in organizations, organizational communication, interpretive person. And then I kind of straddle that line. So there's not a ton of us, but I still think that it's helpful to make use of both for a lot of people. And, if your field is really, really, really against it, also be clear about what your goals are. If you're wanting to get a PhD and take that to teach, then what helps market you best within your field? And it may be that one type of method could help you get along further than another. But I'd also say like, make sure it's something you want to do as well. Let's see. Does a mixed-based approach help you turn numbers into words? Ooh. I might ask for additional clarification on this one. Oh, maybe that was actually already answered because I see the follow-up there. They're separate from each other. The numbers are just saying, again, like an average score, a percentage. If I know that, some stats from our, again, me and my colleagues did a 1,947 people, representative sample of Americans, to ask them about well-being during COVID. And I knew that only 50% of my sample was working, and that half of those who were not working had lost their job because of COVID. And those are stats that kind of inform, I think, the mentality of my sample. So then 25% of my total sample had lost their job because of the pandemic. But you also still had 50% of people who were still working. And so that could tell us something too. And so that, the stats can be really helpful. But those words, hearing from people about their experience. So in this study, we did actually have a couple of short open-ended questions that we coded to say, like, how is it working from home? Or, you know, how do you balance burnout in the household when you've got kids and parents and family around all the time? And so they complement each other. I don't think it's about turning one into the other, but saying they both can help us get a much more complete picture of our data. Great questions.
So I received the question, are there any programs that you would recommend for each kind of research to help make sorting and organizing data easier?
Yeah, so if you have the patience to learn it, first, quantitative research R can be your best friend and it's free. UNLV gives everyone access to SPSS as well. So if you make use of the, God, what's the name of the program? There's like where you can like route into the computers in the labs, and then it'll immediately allow you access to SPSS. And that's what my students do right now for analyzing their data for their theses. So that's one thing. And if maybe your department also buys student licenses. For qualitative, I mentioned that the programs that I really like, I use one called Deduce. So I'll type it again in the chat here. And that one, like I said, is just a nice cheap qualitative program and is really nice because it helps you kind of visualize your data. So when I'm coding things qualitatively, and like I said, this is where, since the words matter so much, I can highlight things in my transcripts and it'll pop those into a whole other area. So I can be like, these are the quotes I know I want to use. It's not just that they represent a theme, but these are things that I want to include in my paper. And so that's really helping for organize things in that regard. A lot of people love in Vivo. So oops, was starting to try to type. And that one's helpful as well, but is very so if your department doesn't have it, you might not have access regularly to it. But there's different things with both Quant and Qual and lots of really good open access resources. Kent State Libraries has a fantastic SPSS guide, like step by step, everything you could possibly want to know to do for descriptive and inferential statistics. I highly recommend it for my students. I'm trying to get UNLV libraries to create one as well, but they're like, why would we build one when Kent State has such a good one? So I definitely recommend that as a resource as well for stats stuff. Yeah, great question. I hope I answered what was being asked there for programs. I assumed you meant computer programs. Yeah, if you've got questions about qualitative or quantitative research afterwards, please feel free to chat with me. I'm happy to devote and share different sources with you all that I've got. Like I said, I love methods and think they're really interesting. I just dropped my email in the chat. You know, if for people who are interested in qualitative research, I cannot say enough good things about a qualitative researcher from University of Arizona State. I almost said the wrong one and she'd hate me for that. Sarah Tracy is at Arizona State University. She actually has a YouTube series where she talks about qualitative research. So if you look up her name, she's got a website and a YouTube series, posts fantastic things. Another thing that I'll share with Nevena for you all, again, this is comm people, so take it with a grain of salt, but I actually worked with a set of comm people all over the country to build a YouTube series where each of us just talked about methods and sort of things we wish people knew about research methods. So like one person's like, I don't think people care enough about ethics, and ethics are very important. And mine was, I think that your research questions should drive what you're doing and you shouldn't be afraid of one method. But those are really cool to walk through and just kind of hear different academics talk about and say, here's what I do, here's how I approach it, here's what I think you should know if you're still kind of thinking about research methods.
Thank you, Natalie. I'll give everyone else another minute to think about it, see if you have any other questions. Feel free to type them in the chat or just unmute yourself. Oh, there's another question.
Yeah, I started to read it. Are there any methods you would recommend having as a social scientist? My undergraduate background was very interpretive. I've been focused on primarily quantitative during graduate school. I've had courses in ethnography, research design, 2 courses in R, game theory. You have taken a lot of methods classes, so it's very impressive. I would say that, again, so 2 classes I took that I thought were just really good foundational as a quantitative scholar was an entire class dedicated to regression analysis, which allowed me to make sense of like mixed methods, hierarchical, or sorry, not mixed methods, but multi-level modeling, hierarchical regressions, sort of when my data is stacked, what that means. And then I also took a class entirely in what's called analysis of a variance, or also ANOVA, which helped me again make sense of when I'm trying to do group analysis. So for instance, I said like politically, this is one of the things I look at. So being able to compare independents, Democrats, and Republicans requires group analysis, or ANOVA, and sort of the levels to that. And while those are a portion of classes I teach, we're talking about entire semester devoted to it versus like a week. So I really thought that just kind of getting that foundation was really, really helpful for me for data analysis. Another question I see there, how does method relate to paradigm? Fantastic question. So I think you even saw earlier in the chat, somebody asked and said, and they even paired them up, and I tried to do that a little at the start of my presentation. A true positivist is like capital T truth. There is meaning. We can say A leads to B, and that's how it is. A post-positivist is like little t truth. I definitely think things are like true, and I can make use of quantitative methods. Again, positivist, quantitative, definitely using quantitative. But I also recognize that there might be some subjective meaning, which is where using things like qualitative methods can be helpful. So I identify primarily as a post-positivist. And then the next level over with interpretive, that's where you're saying, look, the world is subjective. Your experience and my experience, we can't really try to like generalize those to a greater population. There's going to be differences, nuances in what we do. And so that's where you, again, ethnography, participant observation really start to come out as well. Books that recommend for R. My bookshelf's behind me. I really like this book, Learning R. It is from, it's a step-by-step from Richard Cotton, I think is a great book. I'll share that there with you all. But yeah, that's one I'm a big fan of. And I also I think R is really good with online resources. So I'll definitely, again, and sort of, I'm just like making a mental list for myself of things to share with you all. And so we'll get that added in as well. But that's a book that I'm a fan of. I'll also say last book I'll recommend real quick, since I'm sitting here, if I can find it. If you're a qualitative person, then I really recommend, oh, there it is. Yeah, this one. It's called Qualitative Communication Research Methods. And while I know it's communication, I think they do a good job of applying across disciplines. It's Linloff and Taylor, and they actually just had a new edition come out. So the last edition, I think, is really helpful for people as well. So I definitely would recommend that book as a qualitative. Anything from Silverstein and Marvasti is great for qualitative as well. And then there's like lots of good online resources. I see a next question, someone coming from the quantitative side. What's a good way to include more qualitative methods? I've been taking quant regression method courses focusing on regression since undergrad. Yeah, so that's where maybe including those open-ended questions in your surveys. So when you build out quantitatively to sort of make sense of, and even if you're just plugging a little bit of that in, I think it can be helpful. I also think one thing I teach about in my research methods class when we talk about research ethics is saying, what about returning things back to the participants? So we get member checks a lot with qualitative and engaging with the population. I think we don't do that as much as quantitative. So even if you were taking the time to just share your quantitative findings with participants and then being like, yeah, that's our experience, then that gives you something additional to add when talking about your findings to say, this fits the lived experience of the people that I'm studying. So kind of a simple way to approach it, I think. And also, if your field doesn't require it and you don't feel like you have to make use of it, you don't have to be mixed methods. It's just that sometimes it works better. I think that because it helps express things more holistically, that's why I'm a big fan of both. Let's see, book suggestions for quant and mixed methods. So R was the one for quant that I really liked. I'm turning around again real quick to my bookshelf for other books I've got here that I would recommend. So let's see if it's even there. It might be at my other bookshelf. Yep, I think that it's on my other bookshelf. But so I would say that for mixed methods, I actually don't really have a book that I love because I tend to look at those separately, but I'm going to share that article with you all that talks about mixed methods. So it's Benoit and Holbert in 2008 wrote a really lovely short piece about making use of mixed methods, and in particular what we mean when we say triangulation. And then quantitative only, that's where I think the online resources, so I was saying the Kent State Libraries is fantastic for research methods. For quantitative SPSS use versus R is sort of the two things you might use most often. Yeah, those would be my big ones. I actually don't even use a textbook in my quant class. I use articles instead. Yeah. Hopefully I'm answering questions. If you still have some, feel free to drop them in the chat. I am dropping in the chat real quick. This is that YouTube playlist I was talking about that I participated in, that you can see different researchers talking about sort of what are the things they think people would use and make sense of. I don't have a YouTube channel for methods. I do have a website that's my name, that has a section with researcher or resources for grad students and undergrads. So you can certainly click and follow that as well. I've got, the very first thing for grad students is a happiness and well-being report. I think that as a grad student, more than anything else, you should be taking care of yourselves first and foremost. So, feel free to use those resources too.
Thank you so much, Natalie. If we don't have any other questions, I guess we'll wrap up. But before we do, just a huge thank you to you for sharing your time with us and answering all our questions. It was very beneficial and informative. And thank you to all the participants for joining us, coming to learn something new. Before everyone logs off, please just take 2 minutes to fill out this workshop feedback survey we dropped in the chat here. It just helps us improve the workshops we provide you, so we appreciate if you can just do that. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you.
I will share those resources, I promise. Thanks. Bye, everyone.